All right, Loretta, it's 6 o'clock.
Yes.
And we can start our lovely presentation.
Ça, c'est quelqu'un qui s'appelle Mary Calvi. Tout ce qu'elle dit,
Okay.
c'est
So, hi all.
là, c'est la personne qui parle. Laisse-moi faire.
Je te dis qu'il faut faire un double clic.
Okay, we have some people who haven't muted their mics yet. Let me try to find where they are.
Sortir de...
Everyone who comes in, can you please mute your mics?
Voilà, c'est ça que je voulais te dire.
Okay, let me find who this person is who's talking.
Ce que tu as dit.
C'est ce que j'ai dit, il faut double click.
It's French, so that's interesting. Let me keep going till I find them. I think I found them.
C'est bien le review, c'est tout.
Non, il ne faut pas garder.
Non, le poser de gagner.
What? There's nothing I can do.
Voilà.
Hang on, while we find these people who are still talking.
What am I supposed to do?
I think I found them.
Send the 2 seconds, just resend the invite. Turn off your camera for a half second.
No.
Okay, I think we're good, Loretta. We found everybody muted who needed to be muted, and you have the talking.
Okay, just one technical thing. Could you send another re-invite to Priscilla at Chester Village?
Sure.
That'll do it, right, Ian?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, great. Right, well, hi all, welcome. I'm Loretta Goldberg, and I will be moderating this Zoom book launch event, Lovers and Revolutionaries in the Age of Enlightenment. This was a time when everything was upended. What's a good society? What a bad one? What rights do individuals have? How to relate to one another? So it's a time that can resonate today. So I want to give a special welcome to members of Chester Village who are watching on a big TV screen. And I am moderating this from Chester Village. So welcome all. Now, please, just as a reminder from Susan, Zoom watchers, mute your mics until after our guest authors' wonderful presentations. Now, let me just say a word about the format. I will introduce each author as they present for 10 minutes each. I think we need some more mics muted. Okay. And their books are available on Amazon or any good bookstore like R.J. Julia in Connecticut, any good bookstore. After the presentations, our chairperson, Faith Justice, will talk about the Historical Novel Society for a minute. Don't worry, we're not going to ask you for any money. Now, after that, all Zoom watchers, you can unmute your mics and it'll be open Q&A. Because we have something like 100 people watching on Zoom, I'm going to ask for 3 people to say your names, and those 3 people will ask questions, and then I'll ask for another 3 and another 3. So we'll do it like that. Now, a bit of state-of-the-art technology. And for those watching on TVs, if you have any questions afterwards, then you can send it to me and I will forward it to our amazing authors tomorrow. Now, a bit of a state-of-the-art technology. If our presenters go beyond the 10 minutes, you will hear the gentle sound of a spoon hitting glass. For the rest, I have made an offering to the ferocious god of glitches to appease her, and I can only hope that she will favor us tonight. Finally, the order. I have asked the authors to present chronologically in terms of when their stories begin. This means that Mary Calvi will go first, because her story of George Washington and Mary Philipse begins in approximately 1754. Now, Mary Calvi is a 10 times Emmy winner for TV breaking news coverage of, and the most notable being the landing of US Airways Flight 154 on the Hudson River without casualties. I think you all remember that, the miracle on the Hudson. She earned her broadcast journalism degree from Syracuse University, worked in radio a bit, and is now a co-anchor on CBS. Yes, you can see her on TV. She is the First Lady of the City of Yonkers and a member of the board of the Hudson River Museum. The Phillips family, the family of Mary Phillips, has always fascinated her. This is her first historical novel. Welcome, Mary. Go.
Loretta, thank you so much. It's so good to see all of you, even though we're virtual. It's just lovely to see so many readers, and it has been really quite a remarkable opportunity for me. Really, I never thought I would find a story from the 1700s, and certainly not one about George Washington that hadn't been found before. I have some of the historic documents, so I thought maybe I could show some of them to you. And if you have any questions for me, you can certainly ask about the book, or as my work with my work on television as well. And I just found out today, in fact, it was announced that I also have the opportunity to work on Inside Edition. I'll be the weekend anchor there, as well as the fill-in for Deborah Norval. So I just adore Deborah Norval, so I'm really, really excited about that. But I'm here to talk to you about historical novels and writing. And again, if any of you are thinking about writing a book, I would love to ask the other authors as well, but I think you should do it. It was an incredible journey, and one that I had never expected for myself. But I truly felt kind of empowered to be able to tell a story of a woman who had been forgotten about in history. So let me tell you about her. So Mary Phillips, right here, if you can see, this is a painting that was done of George Washington and Mary Phillips. Mary Phillips, in fact, was, I believe, the richest single woman in colonial America at the time. And everyone was interested in her. She owned thousands of acres of property. In fact, her family owned 250,000 acres of property all along the Hudson River. And we're talking about from Connecticut, you can keep on going over to the Hudson River and then all the way down into Harlem. And she was a wealthy woman. In fact, she had a prenuptial agreement. They called it an ante-nuptial back then. But that's another story. Right now, what I wanted to tell you about is her relationship with the George Washington. It was quite remarkable. George was a colonel in the French and Indian War, and had become quite popular at the time. He was in his early 20s, and he was a stud. He was like, I know you wouldn't think of George Washington in that way, neither did I. So I was quite surprised when I learned some things about him and Mary as well. But when I went back to do research, I did research at Harvard University, at Houghton Library. Really, it really ran the gamut. I was doing research kind of all over the world, a lot of it digitally, and I was quite incredibly amazed at how much the archivists knew and were able to find for me. And I was telling Michelle just earlier that I found that like the digital archives and the physical archives sort of collided. So if you're thinking about physical historical research, now is absolutely the time, because you can find the collections digitally, and then the archivist can help you find the documents. And that's one of the first things I wanted to present to you. This is one of the documents. I know it's a little bit hard to see. It's actually, if any of you have seen the novel, it's actually the end papers in the novel. When you open the book, I was able to obtain the rights to it. This is actually a list of all of the men who wanted to court Mary Phillips. It's an actual list of potential suitors, written in sort of a witty way. But what was interesting about the list, it was quite eye-opening and remarkable for me to find this, because I'll tell you why. Mary Phillips, who lived in my hometown. In fact, she lived in a beautiful historic manor in my hometown called Phillips Manor. My husband's the mayor of the city of Yonkers, where we live, and he had his inaugural ceremony at this gorgeous manor. And I had said to him, as a little girl, I remembered the story, local lore, of how George Washington courted the belle who lived there, Mary Phillips. And so as he was planning on his speech, I said to him, maybe you should mention that supposedly George Washington courted Mary Phillips, who lived here. And he said, well, that would be a great idea. But did he? So I thought, well, let me ask around. And when no one knew, not even in the historical societies, I thought, well, let me try to find the research. And I truly was stunned by what I discovered, because not only did I find that George Washington courted Mary Phillips, according to historians like Henry Cabot Lodge, who has a PhD from Harvard in history, he said not only did he court her, he fell in love with Mary Phillips. So that was the start of the research. And so their relationship was quite fascinating. And now George at the time was a colonel, and he was fighting with the British in the French and Indian War. So when I found this list of suitors, I fell over, and I'll tell you why. The men on this list were actually George Washington's commanders in the British Army. I mean, the general in charge is on the list of suitors. And I thought, well, that's odd. But also on this list are men who I believe wronged George Washington to get to his girl. And so I'll explain. So one of the men on the list, after George had come to New York, actually, and met Mary Phillips, he was stationed at a fort in Virginia. And really, it was half built. It was surrounded by the enemy. And he had not enough men and not enough weapons. So George makes a request of one of the men on the list and says, I need additional funds to finish the fort. And the man on this list denied George Washington the funds to finish the fort. And when George Washington said, I need additional men, additional weapons, the man who denied him that is also on this list of potential suitors. Then George Washington, when he's at this fort, asks for time off. I want leave, 10 days off, 12 days off. I believe it was to come back up to New York and maybe ask for Mary's hand in marriage. But the man who denied Washington this time off time and time again is actually on the list of potential suitors. And then came this. It was really, really stunning for me to discover, but it was an article that was written at the time, and it blasts George Washington, and it calls him a gambler, a debaucher. I mean, it really claims just awful things about the colonel of the Virginia Regiment, who was George Washington. It's written anonymously, but after doing extensive research, I believe I realized who it was that was on the list, and it is one of the men on the list of potential suitors. So it could go on and on, so I could tell you about what I was finding. And really, it took me quite a long time to really feel very confident that what I was finding was actually true. So I spent years just going through these puzzle pieces that were creating this incredible story of not just love, but also deception, and then in the end, vengeance. Because you're talking, this bitter resentment is developed in George Washington, and you can see it in his letters against not only his commanders, but the British Army in general. And he holds on to that bitter resentment for a number of years. And we're talking, 20 years before the American Revolution began. So you don't see any change. And I read all the letters he wrote at that time. You don't see any change in George Washington's feelings towards the British Army. And then he comes in as general in the American Revolution. And fascinating in this at this time is because when George Washington becomes general, and this is 20 years after his relationship ended with Mary Phillips, and I don't want to give away all the details as to what happened there, but it was quite juicy actually and dramatic. But 20 years later, when he becomes general, the first place George Washington comes to really is New York. And he comes with Martha, and so I'm tracking, where is he? Did he come near Mary Phillips? And so I was quite fascinated to find out exactly where he stayed when he was commander in the American Revolution. So his letters say that George Washington came to New York, and this was in June of 1776, and he came with Martha, who, by the way, he had met after he met Mary. So it was like sort of before Martha, there was Mary. So he comes with Martha to New York, and in his letters, you can see that he says, Martha, it's quite dangerous. He's telling her family that he believes Martha should go back to Virginia, which she does. So then Washington actually moves to a place called Mount Washington in New York. And as a journalist in New York, I figured I must know where Mount Washington is, but I just can't remember it. So I kept going through my head and trying to figure out, well, where was Mount Washington? And I was able to find an incredible map in England that showed me where Mount Washington was. And I have a replica of it, and I'll grab it if anybody's interested so you can see it, at least digitally. And it turns out when Martha left to go to Virginia, George Washington moves soon to Mount Washington. And from what I realized, it turns out that Mount Washington is actually Mary's estate in Harlem, which was named after her husband, and it was named Mount Morris. When Washington moved there into her mansion, he renamed Mount Morris Mount Washington. And he stayed there for about 6 weeks. And he also stayed at a number of other properties that belonged to Mary Phillips, about 5 different properties that she owned along the Hudson River, as did her family. The story of Mary is interesting, of course, because I wondered, well, was Mary there when George Washington stayed there? And I was able to access all of the letters that had been written to Mary by her then husband, whose name was Roger Morris. And I went through to figure out, well, where was Mary? And Roger Morris, her husband at the time, had taken off and had gone to England and left Mary by herself at the Harlem estate. And I believe Mary was living in Harlem at what Washington called Mount Washington when George stayed there for 6 weeks. Now, it's a big estate, so I thought, well, I'm sure she was staying in one wing and he was staying in another. You know, I can't imagine they were staying near each other. So when I went to the mansion, and it's called Morris Jumel Mansion, in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote parts of Hamilton inside that mansion. Is a beautiful spot to visit if anybody is interested. It's a beautiful historic site. So when I asked one of the folks in charge at Morris Jumel, I said, well, where would George Washington have slept? And they said, oh, this is his bedchamber, so it's right here. We definitely know this is where he stayed. And I said, okay, well, where would the woman of the house have been living at the time? And he said, well, the woman of the house would have been staying over here in this room. And I thought, okay, well, at least there's a big giant wall in between them. And I think I said that out loud, like, phew, at least there's a big wall in between them. And they said, well, actually, back then, when we look at the blueprints, there were 2 doors that were open in between the rooms. Now, I didn't know what to do with that information, but I thought I had to put it into the novel. So if anybody has read it, I hope I did a good enough job, because I was really like, what do I do with this information? But throughout the story and finding these little details was quite incredible. And what happened to Mary was absolutely wrong and tragic in history. And she's been labeled this a traitor from back then. And I don't want to give away the details as to how that all happened, but I was like, was this woman wronged? What happened to her? I was really actually upset about what happened to Mary Phillips. And so I thought I had this opportunity to possibly write this book, and the publishers were very interested in it. And I thought, well, this is something I'd never expected for myself, but let me tell her story. So it was really quite an honor to tell her story, because I believe she's a woman who's been wronged for centuries.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. So we'll have questions later. So next, Julieta Rodrigues. Honored to welcome you from Portugal. And Julieta, hello, Portugal, your friends, your family, your colleagues. So Julieta Rodrigues has had 2 volumes of short stories published, On the Road to Red Square and the Rogue and Other Portuguese Stories. She earned a PhD from Columbia University, New York, in sociology and education. She divides her time between New York and Sintra, Portugal, I hope I pronounced that right, which is where she is right now. And she has affiliations in both countries. She's a member of the Pen Club in Portugal and also the Fulbright Commission team of evaluators in Portugal. She brings deep personal experience to her tale of Eleanor and Joseph, who were 2 Southern European Enlightenment figures that I certainly had never heard of before I met Julieta, and I suspect some of the rest of us haven't. She grew up in Portugal, came of age in the 1970s, when Portugal was going through a revolution itself towards democratization. And later she lived in the Soviet Union as the wife of an American diplomat during the Cold War, that is 1983. So she has seen many societies in upheaval. So welcome, Julieta. Eleonora and Joseph, introduce us to them.
Hello, good evening. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you, Susan, for organizing and teaching us about Zoom. Thank you, Loretta, for this opportunity. This is a great panel, and I'm looking forward to our discussion afterwards. I would like to greet Anna Lawton, my publisher, whom I see here on the screen. She's in Washington, D.C., so I greet you too. And it is an honor for me to be here to discuss my book, Eleonora and Joseph, Passion, Tragedy, and Revolution in the Age of Enlightenment, with two distinguished writers, Mary Calvi and Michelle Cameron. So let me start. I'm reading for a script, and I hope this is all right with everybody. To my right is a picture of the location where the two families of my two main characters, Eleonora and Joseph, come from. This is a small town in the Alentejo region of Portugal, a part of Southern Europe. I hope two things are visible, so typical of this region: the church pinnacle and the houses in blue and white. In the back, you see also a large water tank, but I am sure this was not there in the 18th century. This is a contemporary depiction. So this is where the families of my characters come from. Let me tell you about my book. Let me tell you the story that I constructed. As my novel opens, aristocratic Eleonora Fonseca Pimentel pleads with the High Court of Naples to be beheaded instead of hanged like a criminal. We are in 1799. One of the leading revolutionaries of her time, Eleonora contributed to the establishment of the Neapolitan Republic, a republic based on the ideals of the French Revolution. In prison, after the return of the monarchy, the republic lasted for about 5 months, and while waiting to be sentenced for her work in the newspaper Il Monitore Napoletano, she writes a memoir in my novel. Here, she discusses not only her revolutionary enthusiasm, but also the adolescent lover who abandoned her, Joseph Correia da Serra. While visiting Monticello many years later, Joseph discovers Eleonora's manuscript in Thomas Jefferson's vast library. We are in 1813 now. This is a totally plausible literary device. Throughout his life, Jefferson received all the time's books from France, and many of the revolutionaries called the Jacobins, who left Naples for exile after the Republic was defeated, many of them, those who were allowed to leave, went to France. So we are in 1813 now. Now retired, Jefferson is committed to founding the University of Virginia and entices Correia with a position when the university opens. As the two philosophers explore Eleonora's writing through the lens of their own lives, achievements, and follies, they share many intimate secrets. Who is Correia? Correia is a naturalist, a botanist, known everywhere. He has a huge network of contacts throughout Europe and establishes them in America as well. And later on, he becomes a diplomat, and he has the position of the first ambassador from the Kingdom of Portugal and Brazil to the United States. The Kingdom of Portugal Brazil was united at this time. My story is told in alternating chapters, either from Eleonora or from Joseph's point of view. And I use for both first-person narratives. I had a lot of fun with this part of the book because I am forever describing an event seen from the point of view of Eleonora or seen from the point of view of Joseph Correia. And I truly enjoy that. So what do we have here? We have here three main characters in interaction about the memoir of one of them who wrote it many years later. Eleonora, the woman, is now dead, having left behind a testimony of her life. The two men happen to be friends, and as they discuss the memoir that I have in front of them, they bring many memories about their lives and they put into question their own lives as they are reading and discussing the text. So what are my settings here? Eleonora writes her memoir from the confinements of a filthy prison in Naples, which is the capital of the Kingdom of Naples. Joseph and Jefferson are meeting in Monticello in the alternating chapters always. But as they talk, they go into their past. And they mention the elegant salons of Naples, the streets of European capitals such as Lisbon, London, and Paris, and they discuss the cultured New World of Philadelphia and the chic dinner parties in Washington. Eleonora and Joseph existed as much as Thomas Jefferson and remain still today prominent figures of the Southern European Enlightenment. I quote many times in my novel Jefferson's high esteem for Joseph Correia de Serra. And I quote, "The most learned man I have ever met." This is from a man who knew everybody, who had been in Paris for several years and says this about Joseph. Then he goes, quote, "I shall hope you passing in Monticello as much of the summer as you can," end of quote. Another quote, "Stay with us, become our instructor." Jefferson throughout the book is trying to convince Correia to accept the position that he wants him to have at the University of Virginia. This was a remarkable friendship, so remarkable that the room where Joseph stayed in Monticello still bears his name today. Eleonora and Joseph, together with Thomas Jefferson, were part of what we generally call in the 18th century the Republic of Letters, a formidable network of thinkers who radically influence the intellectual world in which they live and which we still inhabit today. These were wonderful characters, not easy characters, but wonderful characters to live with during the years that took me to write this novel. You know, the range of emotions was amazing. They were tragic, deceitful, engaged, genial. And it was this amalgamation that really created the thread of my novel. So I am ready to answer any questions when the discussion opens, and I'm looking forward to that. So many thanks for listening.
Thank you, Julieta. Well, it amazed me when I read Michelle Cameron's Beyond the Ghetto Gates that her novel was set in about the same time, 1797 to 1799, and here we have not a revolutionary government in Naples, but we have Napoleon freeing the Jews in a town on the other side of Italy. So Michelle Cameron is a director of the Writers Circle, a New Jersey-based organization that offers creative writing to children as well as adults. She has written other works. In the Shadow of the Globe, won an award, and she has also written a historical novel in verse, The Fruit of Her Hands, the story of Shira Ashkenaz, who appears to be a medieval ancestor of Michelle's. Beyond the Ghetto Gates has just been given the 2020 Silver Medal Award for Historical Fiction by the Independent Book Publisher Award. So welcome, Michelle. Take us to the Jewish Ghetto Gates.
Thank you so much, Loretta. So I am telling a story which actually takes place in 1796 and 97, when a 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte was chasing the Austrians out of Italy. He was actually opened up a second front in the French battles against the Austrians. And as he was making lightning strikes through Italy, seemingly unstoppable, Napoleon first discovered that the Jews were locked behind ghetto gates in the harbor city of Ancona, a city that I have to say I have still never been to. But I feel like I inhabited that city for several years as I was writing this book. In a typically symbolic gesture, Napoleon dispatched Jewish soldiers to tear these gates down and liberate the Jewish residents of Ancona. People often ask me, because very few people have actually heard this particular episode in Jewish history, and they ask me, why did I select this and this fairly unknown period? And I myself learned about this when I was reading Michael Goldfarb's nonfiction book, Emancipation: How Liberating Europe's Jews from the Ghetto Led to Revolution and Renaissance. And I remember reading the passage where Goldfarb described Napoleon locked out of the ghetto gates and ordering them struck down. That incident clearly had novel written all over it. But to bring the story to life, I knew I'd have to enter the lives of the people who were affected by Napoleon's actions. So Beyond the Ghetto Gates tells the story of two women, one Jewish, the other Catholic. Morel, my Jewish heroine, wants nothing more than to further her father's legacy and work with him. Her mother, and particularly the city rabbi, refused to allow her to do so, insisting that she should be married and be a good Jewish housewife and mother. Francesca, who is a devout Catholic, feels trapped in a marriage to an abusive and ultimately murderous husband. She is the first to see a miracle portrait of the Madonna in Ancona's cathedral. Francesca is brought up to suspect and revile the Jews, but begins to doubt her beliefs as she gets to know Daniel, one of Bonaparte's Jewish soldiers. As a historical novelist, I've been blessed by discoveries, gifts in a manner of speaking, made during my research. And of course, like all the historical novelists who are watching today, you all know exactly how much research has to go into putting together a book like this one. So certainly you can see some of the books behind me, but I also haunted the library. I went to the Metropolitan Museum a great deal and only wish they'd let those velvet ropes down for me so I could literally walk into those rooms. They didn't do it. And I spent a lot of time reading books about that period. And it's very fortunate that I am a huge admirer of Jane Austen. I think I reread all of her books twice as I was writing this novel. So I did, as I said, focused on Napoleon's campaign through Italy. his tearing down of the ghetto gates. I placed the novel in Ancona because that was where Napoleon first discovered the Jews. I read about anti-Semitic riots that took place there just before Bonaparte arrived, and I learned about the real-life characters of Ancona, including the Morpurgo brothers, Jews whom Bonaparte appointed to the municipal council he formed in order to oust the Pope and his control. But one of the things I found in writing historical novels is that the story is as important as the history. And in order to inform the story, the plot line, research gave me two tremendous gifts, things that would make all the difference to the novel's dramatic arc. The first gift was learning that Ancona had a reputation of being the world center of ketubah making. A ketubah is a Jewish marriage certificate. And Ancona was actually the first to illuminate these, and it contains some of the most talented scribes and artists in the Jewish world. And they produce these absolutely exquisite marriage licenses. These have a very distinctive shape. They have sort of a curve at the top and then a little point, which is called an ogee arch. And because of this distinctive shape, when I went to exhibits of Judaica in such places as Toronto, Edinburgh, and New York, I would always be able to point to a ketubah and say, that came from Ancona. And every single time I did, I was absolutely right. The ketubah workshops of Ancona gave me a passion for Morel, my heroine. She wanted to be part of her family's legacy and to continue to work to help manage the workshop. But the city's rabbi and her mother's wish to see her wed well was preventing her from doing so. Morel, like so many young women of her time, was raised to marry rich, a duty that would run counter to her own happiness. Eventually, Morel received a proposal of marriage from none other than her best friend's father. These days, we would think that's pretty awful, but you only have to read Regency fiction to learn how often older men would take younger brides, particularly if they wanted a male heir. Morel didn't want to marry her best friend's father. She wanted to marry a dashing young French Catholic soldier, and she even contemplated running away with him. And there were some problems of intermarriage, not just then, but certainly previously, that we may get to talking about. The second gift of research that I got was stumbling upon the miracle of La Madonna del Duomo. Ancona, up in its cathedrals, was a beautiful portrait of the Virgin Mother. And at a very auspicious time, right before Napoleon was due to attack the city, this portrait supposedly smiled, cried, and turned to stare at the congregation. So one of the wonderful bits of research that actually one of my students helped me do was to find the Vatican recount of this miracle. And it introduced me to two characters who play a great role in the book. Francesca Moratti, as I said, the Catholic woman trapped in this abusive marriage, and her daughter, Barbara. In addition, I stumbled on an anecdote which absolutely fascinated me, and I don't think there's a historical novelist alive who could have resisted this. And this was Napoleon's alleged reaction when he saw the portrait. Napoleon, like conquerors before and after him, was busy looting the treasures of Italy. And so he was in the process of cleaning out the cathedral in Ancona when he happened upon the portrait. In a scene that I portray in the novel, he stared in it, he challenged it, and something in the portrait made him turn pale, reach over, grab a golden cloth, and throw it on the portrait. It's a great scene. What I did, though, is that portrait would become truly a plot device in the book, and everything that follows that encounter was completely fictional. That's all Michelle there. So, so then, you know, one of the other things that I tried very hard to follow the history of was to follow Bonaparte's actual campaign as he made his way, his military campaign through Italy. And I'm still waiting, but I know eventually there's going to be some Napoleonic enthusiast out there who will definitely tell me what I got wrong there. Morel's dilemma: to marry this older man or to run away with her dashing Gentile French soldier, highlights a theme that I've explored in nearly all of my writing. And that is the problem of assimilation, where at the time of the Enlightenment, at the time of the French Revolution, Jews were given citizenship for the first time in France. It's why there are Jewish soldiers in Napoleon's troops, because now they had the duties of, as well as the privileges of citizenship. The problem, however, is with the air of Enlightenment thinking, the air of freedom going through France and Europe at this time, it's very difficult for the Jews at that time to know where to draw the line. And certainly intermarriage is one of those places where that whole dilemma comes to life. In fact, it was one of the first times where a Jew could, in fact, marry a Catholic in France, particularly, because all marriage ceremonies at this time were civil marriage ceremonies. There were no more religious ceremonies in France at the time of the Directory, which is when the novel takes place. So Morel and her dashing Christophe could actually have gotten married at this time. I won't tell you whether they do or don't. And of course, another thing that I explore is the place of women in society, particularly during this period. Women were certainly confined to marriage and raising children. And so this is something that I wanted to portray, but I also struggled with a little bit. And some of the readers that I have said, you know, is she more of a 21st century character or an 18th century character? I call this my feisty heroine problem. And while I am creating an 18th century character, I'm writing for a 21st century audience. And so there is definitely a struggle there. And hopefully I've managed to balance it for the most part. One other theme I wanted to touch upon was how difficult it is, and this is a very, very important theme, I think, these days, is how difficult it is to overcome taught prejudice. The Jews and the Catholics in Ancona lived separate lives before the ghetto gates were torn down, and the resulting clash of cultures contain echoes of our modern day experience. How does one transcend wrong-headed but deeply held beliefs about a group of people who are different? Can getting to know someone personally transcend that bias? And so with Francesca and Daniel's relationship, I got to explore that in all of its messy complexity. And then finally, there's a theme that I had no idea would become important, and that was the theme of social isolation. It's very, very ironic that the novel that I wrote takes place with a community who was locked behind, literally locked behind ghetto gates from sundown to sunrise every single day. It's a very different type of social isolation than the one that we're living. But it is highly ironic that the book was published just as things were happening, and that I am attempting to promote it at this time. And so this, this was definitely a labor of love for me. And like my other two panelists, I'm eager to hear your questions and to get some discussion going.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle. So 1 minute, I think Faith Justice will say something about the Historical Novel Society, and then it's open Q&A. So please, when we start the Q&A, if we have a lot of people watching, and I think a lot of people are going to want to ask questions, so if you could state your name, and I will take the first 3 names and the first 3 questions, then we'll do the same process again for as long as you want it to go on. Faith, over to you.
Okay, there I am. Again, I want to welcome everybody to this event. It's been lovely. Thank you, panelists. Very interesting information. And one of the things I want to point out is that we're going to be doing more of this. As the Historical Novel Society New York City chapter, we were pretty much confined to our lovely library, the Jefferson Market Street Library, which we adore, but we would have crowds of 25 to 35 people max at most of our meetings. And one of the things that we have found in moving into the digital world is that we can actually do a heck of a lot more. We can give our members a bigger platform. We can give our readers, more access to authors, and we intend to do a lot more of that. In fact, we've got 2 more programs coming up this summer. Normally, we take the summer off, so we're actually expanding. July 28th, we're starting a new series called Storytelling as Advocacy with author Almeida Johnson. She's an award-winning author of fiction for adults and young fiction, young adults, sorry. And she's going to be discussing her new book, The Trouble the Saints, which is set in Harlem. And really looking forward to this. On August 25th, Fanula Austin, who, if any of you did come to one of our live events at the library earlier in the year, Fanula gave us a lovely presentation on Facebook marketing. And her book is coming out, and it's called Bronte's Mistress. She's going to be talking to us about writing historical fiction about real people, and it'll be a Q&A. This is something close to my heart because that's what I write. I write about real historical characters, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you, Faith.
Good. So I hope you enjoy the program, and I would love it if you could give us feedback on what we're doing right, what you would like to see more of. And the way to do that is that you can get in touch with us online, and we will be posting all of our links in the chat. But if you received an email from us saying, here's your Zoom link, on it had all the links to our email, our website. We've got a Facebook group, we've got Instagram, and we got Twitter. So, you can get in touch with us directly that way. If you would be interested in participating on some of our panels, you want to pitch a program to us, we not only do books, but we also do kind of how-tos. That's what Fanula is going to be doing about how to write about real historical figures. I've done things on research. We've had all different kinds of programs. So we're reaching out. We're reaching pretty large audiences, and I'm glad that you joined us for this one as well. So our future is on the digital. I will be very happy when we can get back into our library and have a Christmas party, but you know, that will happen when it happens. So I'll turn it back over to Loretta, and thank again everybody for participating and our guests.
Okay, so we are now at open Q&A. So could I have the first 3 people who'd like to ask questions to our wonderful, amazing authors? And by the way, their books are available at Amazon and any good bookstore. So anybody have a question?
How's there still a missile locking on? Who is trying to kill me? You are a bum.
What's this?
This guy literally just tracked me.
Okay, anybody have a question?
You guys are murdering us. No.
All right, I have a question then. Let me start. I have a question for Julieta Rodrigues. Julie.
I'm here.
What? Why don't I die?
I can't hear the question.
I can't hear you.
Loretta, your mic is off.
Oh, what?
What's going on?
I don't know, we seem to have problems with Loretta's mic this moment. I'm gonna try and figure out what's happening.
I have a question for Julieta. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. So Julieta, you're writing about people who are very well known in Portugal and the Neapolitan area. So my question for you is, are you going to translate this book into Portuguese?
Oh, no.
Am I going to?
Maybe somebody could mute that phone number.
I literally just died off of spawn.
I'm trying to.
I spawned.
Whoever the host is.
I was there before my camera
There you go.
shifted either way.
I'm trying to figure out who this
No, it
is.
turns
Let me
around, but I was
mute everybody. There.
I mean, Jesus.
All right, I'm going to unmute Grow
Thank you.
and Julieta. There we go. Go ahead.
So again, this is a character. Correa is a very well-known person in Portugal. And so my question is, are you going to translate it into Portuguese? What's your reaction that you're getting from your home country on the story?
Well, I will not translate the book myself, but if someone would like to translate it, this is fine with me. Translation is an art I don't cultivate, but I would love the book to be translated into Portuguese. As I went along in my research, it was very interesting. I was having a lot of conflict dealing with Correa because he's so well known here. And he's someone very well respected in diplomatic circles. And I was seeing someone that I had difficulty relating to. And actually, I'm going to give an interview soon about exactly the difficulties that I went through explaining his character, explaining how basically self-serving he was. And the fact that he's a priest, I think also had a bearing on my, I can't say dislike of him, but I can say difficulty interpreting the person that he was. And as time goes on, He leaves Portugal early on in his life, and as time goes on, he becomes more and more conservative. And one of the interests of depicting the character was to show how through time he becomes more and more conservative, and he ends up as the first ambassador from the Kingdom of Portugal and Brazil to the United States, defending basically the fact that the Portuguese Empire should continue, meaning Brazil will not become an independent country, should continue with an equal status as Portugal, but should continue under the aegis of Portugal. So I had a lot of trouble dealing with these issues, not to mention his position on slavery as well. So it's a conflicting, so to end this, I found him a very conflicting character, and I had difficulty dealing with that character. And I wanted to mention also, my book is not yet out. My book will come out only on July 21st, and it will be coming out in print and in a Kindle edition. So there was a little bit delay that we are explaining due to COVID. Thank you for the question.
All right, next question. Who?
I have a question.
I have a question.
Yes, okay. John?
Yes, hi, I'm John Meyer. I have a question primarily for Michelle, but it could apply to all of our authors. Did you ever run into two conflicting accounts in your research of the same incident? The question is, how did you reconcile these conflicts?
I don't believe I ran into anything that was really a true conflict in this particular novel. I did in my previous one, but really in this one it was fairly straightforward, so I didn't have to contend with that. There were certainly some things where, like I said, my little episode with Napoleon was highly anecdotal, and I used it as drama, and then in my author's note I said it's anecdotal. So that was one way that I dealt with something like that. And I explain in my author's note, obviously, what is truth and what is fiction, which isn't exactly your question, but it sort of,
yeah, relates.
It relates.
Thank you for the answer. Appreciate it.
Mary?
Yes, I ran into quite a bit of that. Before Mary met George, George fought in a battle called the Braddock Expedition, and he was fighting in the French and Indian War on the British side. And so George Washington in that battle is shot through his coat, 4 times he's shot through his hat. And we have always heard the stories from the British side. And it's quite different when you look at the enemy side. So I went to the enemy's journals to find out how they were viewing George Washington in that fight. It was quite amazing to read what they had said. So George is really last man standing in this, and that's how he becomes a commander in the British Army. And interestingly, when I went to the enemy side, you see a really quite incredible story about the chief of the Native American tribe that was fighting on that side in that battle. And he talks about how he fired upon George Washington 17 times, and the bullets just kept missing, and all of them fired on George Washington. And later on in his life, he goes to see George Washington and tells him the story of that expedition, of how they could not seem to bring George Washington down. And this chief tells George Washington that he supports him because he believes he is guided by the heavens. It's quite an incredible story, and I really enjoyed reading both sides because both were very different. So it gave me an opportunity to tell the story in a broader view.
Great.
Okay, another question?
I have one.
Stephanie?
Yes, okay, so I'm a member of the Historical Novel Society in New York, and I love this program really because I'm struggling. Of course, I'm always struggling with revisions. And my question is generally, I answer this for myself, and then I have to re-answer it and refind it. You know, when you're on your draft number 17 or whatever you are, and I know I read Michelle's novel. I had the pleasure to read it in a much earlier form and was astonished how she transformed it. I mean, what do you do to keep up when it feels like an endless mountain peak? You know, you give it to 3 readers and they say, "Oh, not yet," and then you do it again and then they say, "Not yet." And how do you get the courage to keep going on to try to complete your vision?
I can start with that one, and yes.
Oh yes, please do.
Yes. So yes, Stephanie read a very early version of the novel. Yeah. It changed. It wasn't night and day, but it was like, you know, sunset happened, I guess you would say. And I think for me, how did I have the resilience to keep going with the book is just, I was blessed with some amazing beta readers, Stephanie among them, who every time they gave me a direction, you could see the artistic possibilities there. And that, I think, is more than anything else that brought me forward. I have to give tremendous credit to my son, who actually works at Macmillan, who's an amazing editor, and who I think ended up reading the book something like 7 times. Every time I had to like pull out the mother card and say, "No, you got to read it one more time." But I had a number of really amazing beta readers for this book. And with every vision, it just kept getting better. And I think it's the getting better that does it.
Thanks.
Mary, did you want to jump in for Stephanie?
Oh, sure, Stephanie. Nice to. What a great question.
I can't wait to read your novel.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. You know, for me, it was a bit of a different situation. Maybe I'm not exactly sure about everyone else's, but when I presented the idea of the novel and this, you know, never before told story, just based on that, I was presented a book deal, and it was quite exciting. You know, I had just a book proposal and, you know, the first 50 pages and, you know, the outline, as everyone knows how that works. And so I was under a deadline very quickly, and I didn't have a lot of time to really do draft after draft. I mean, it had to be done. And so I also brought together, you know, the smartest people I knew and tried to write as quickly as I could. And I honestly spent hours every day, over a year and a half, I think, just writing and writing and writing. And I would bribe people, and Michelle and Julieta, I would love to hear how you did it, but I would, you know, spread out the wine and cheese or whatever it took just to bring people over to say, "Hey, I need you to read the kissy parts and tell me what you think." And so it was bringing together the smartest minds, really, and getting as much help as possible. Julieta, to you.
Yeah, you know, I would like to go back to John's issue, this whole question of the conflicting accounts, because this is a fascinating question. And I think the difficulty when we are doing a biography is to catch the sense of the person's life. And I think the more conflicting arguments, the better, or the more conflicting accounts, the better. Because I think we as authors have to figure out the sense of the person, or the way we want to go into explaining whatever happened to that person at a certain particular moment in time. And I think it requires years of reading, and I think it requires years of understanding. And then you form an opinion, and this becomes your character. And then you use your imagination to fill the historical gap.
Bravo.
All right, next question.
Yeah, I have a question. I love this idea of the question of the feisty historical heroine, and I obviously have my own skin in the game on this, but I'd love to hear from the three panelists whether you think characters need to espouse 21st century morality in order to be relatable for a 21st century audience.
Oh, great question.
So again, if I can start off with this one, because this is something I struggle with a lot. And whenever somebody brings this up, I always talk about how my favorite Jane Austen character is Fanny Price. And Fanny Price, you wouldn't find a more demure, meek character when you read the book. And yet when you watch the film, you know, they turned her half into Jane Austen herself and half into this woman who wasn't afraid to stand up to you know, her guardian. And it's a completely wrong reading of the book. And yet it works for a 21st century audience. So, but I struggle with this. And in fact, I have to say that one of the revisions that happened with my novel was the fact that Morel became more and more and more empowered and more, got more agency as the revisions happened. But I still feel it's difficult. We can't really, I think, give a 18th century character and have the readers of today enjoy them. So something I struggle with a lot.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from the other two as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, this is a huge issue. So the question is, Fionnuala, how do you bring a character from the past into the present, right? This is the question.
No, the question is, do you think that a character has to have morality that we would agree with now in order to be relatable or sympathetic? Or do you think that somebody can have very different views, very different biases from their own time and still be a relatable character?
Well, okay, I had an issue with that because I have Correa in Monticello, a plantation with slaves. And how do I deal with this? And how do I bring his understanding of the situation to an audience on the 21st century? And it's a huge issue because you have to be faithful to the character and you have to make the audience understand that what was considered acceptable at that point is not acceptable now. So how do you do this? And how do you do it? With the writing itself. Because many times throughout the Portuguese Empire, what priests thought was that they were saving these people they were saving their souls, bringing them to the realm of God by Catholicism. So I go into a monologue in which Correa does say that. And he's looking around and he's seeing all these slaves that he had never seen before in Europe. And he's surprised. And there is a whole discussion that I make him have with Jefferson about the issue. But he is a man of the 18th century, early 19th century, and he has to speak in that voice. I don't think he can speak with the voice of the 21st century because then we will not be writing historical novels. There wouldn't be any point in doing that.
Mm.
Well, I could just add first, congratulations, Nuala, on your upcoming novel. It's really exciting. And congratulations to you, Julieta, with your upcoming release as well. And, it's such a great question, but I do think that readers are interested in characters who think differently than we do. So I think there could be real attraction to, women that we don't understand. And that, for me, was the case. I wanted to stay as true to character as possible. So I went into the research to find out everything I could about Mary Phillips, as well as the women who around her. And I do think people are drawn to fascinating characters. I wanted her to find strength because she didn't have that. She was really struck with some serious guilt and emotional troubles early on, but being able to empower her and, you know, find her voice was really important to me. But I do think going back into history and learning about women that may think very differently than we do is part of the excitement, I think, in doing research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question related to the one that has just been discussed, but more general. I would like to hear from the three authors how important is for them or for all of us the preservation of history, especially nowadays when we see that there is a tendency, at least among some people, some young people, to destroy the heritage, to deny the heritage, distort history, or just ignore it, destroy statues. So it's a very contemporary issue, and you are deeply involved in historical research. So I would like to hear your opinion.
Well, I could go first. I think truthfulness to the facts is point one. You have to be true to what happened. You have to have an interpretation that has truth at the core of how you go about this. And then you can agree or disagree, but the truth is there and the facts are there. And then the interpretation comes second. I don't know what Michelle and Mary think, but this is my view.
So I agree with that you have to give a truthful record of what actually occurred during the time. I mean, it's a perpetual question, I think, among historical novelists in terms of, you know, how accurate do you need to be to the historical record? And how much can your imagination, you know, sort of deviate a little bit from that? And I think I strike middle grounds here. And that's, again, why I feel like the author's note has to answer those questions, that if you have deviated from historical truth, that you need to lay that out for your reader. In my previous novel, The Fruit of Her Hands, I was telling the story of my rabbi ancestor who lived during the Middle Ages, but I had to create his wife, you know, completely, mainly because women were not recorded in history at that point in time. And I had a number of readers, you know, contact me and say, wait a minute, you mean Shira isn't real? You made her up? So, and I did explain that in my author's note. But I do feel also very strongly that in addition to the historical record, we are historical novelists, and I tend to put the stress on the novelist side, that we also have to tell a story in among telling the truth. So I find it, like I said, I take the middle ground. I find it's a balance. Mary, do you want to take this one?
Sure. You know, I think that's important as a writer to decide upfront whether you want to write nonfiction or whether you want to write historic fiction. And there are two very different categories, as you know. And so you have to really kind of come to terms with that. So for me, I wanted initially to write the book as nonfiction, but that prevented me from really telling the full story of this woman who ended up becoming and being named a traitor in the American Revolution. And so it was a bit of a battle for me as to whether I would do it as nonfiction and present the limited information I had, or to be able to really give her a full voice that I thought she rightfully deserved. And so in that way, I had to create her character in many ways in order to do that. But it is one of those dilemmas that you face as a writer as to what to do with a character that you might have limited knowledge of.
Thank you so much. I take that you are for preserving history instead of destroying the records.
Yeah, if I may say something, I think sometimes collectively a nation cannot face the past or has difficulty in facing the past. And the question is, we as historical novelists can have a contribution to bring the past forward. Because, for instance, the Portuguese were one of the major nations engaged in the slave trade. This is not something that is discussed here, every day, or in books, or in discussions, or on television, or by film, whatever. And so I think collectively, I think we have a role to play here, because we can bring these issues forward. And the more we bring them forward, the more we understand them, and then can relegate them to the history of the time and the period in which they occurred. I think the worst possible thing is what I saw in countries like the Soviet Union, in which you
exactly
silence the voices. The worst that can happen to a nation is to try to silence the voices. As long as there is dialogue, I think things can be unveiled and can be discussed, and the statues can be moved to museums, but you can't deny a colonial past. All of these European countries have a huge colonial past. You cannot deny it, and by destroying the statues, you basically become a terrorist. So maybe the best thing is to put them in museums and call it the museum of whatever. And then we are presenting things in a light that can be understood and discussed.
Thanks.
I have a question. Can I ask my question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my question is for Mary. You were writing about a period in American history where we have the colonials and the loyalists and the British. And I was just kind of wondering how you dealt with the problem or the issue that typically in American movies, fiction, whatever, the colonialists are good guys, the loyalists and the British are really the bad guys. And of course, that's not the reality of it. That's done for an audience in fiction. I was just wondering in this historical piece that you wrote, how you dealt with the fact, with the reasoning that the loyalists had for the positions they took, the reasons that the colonialists had. Did you find that difficult to juggle?
Oh, I just found it completely riveting, because the writings exist and the letters exist, and you can read the letters of Lord Loudon, who was one of the generals in the British Army. So you can actually get his words. So as I was writing the novel, I was taking the actual words of the Brits and of the loyalists. And so it was really quite exciting to be able to see all of that information in front of you. So instead of me creating an opinion of it, I was able actually to go to their actual letters, and I actually have some of the letters themselves. So it's a great question. And so I think that when you're doing something like that, it's probably, when you're doing historic research, it might be best to actually go to the writing itself instead of kind of creating it, because it exists and you can actually find it nowadays and see the letters right in front of you, which I was able to do. So it's a great question, and you're right, you know, forever, we've always seen the one side of it. So through this book, I take a look at some of the characters are from the other side. And so I was able to go back and forth. So that was quite fun to be able to read the journals. And it's incredible that after these centuries, so much still exists.
Thank you very much. And as you were talking, have you been to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia?
I have not been there, and I've been meaning to get there, and I'm looking forward to seeing quite a number of exhibits. I've been online digitally taking a look at it. When I was doing the research, what I was looking for, they didn't exactly have. So I was at the Library of Congress and other places, because I'm going way back, like to the 50s. So they're more in 1778 and after that.
Right. I wasn't talking about for research, just
just to visit. Yeah,
a couple years ago we went, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I hear.
Again. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Not a question, just a quick comment. I just wonder if it's a little bit outside of the scope of this meeting for us to be talking about the rights and wrongs of statues being taken down. And I just personally feel like we're having a much more nuanced discussion talking about historical fiction, which is what we all know a lot about. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case anybody was feeling uncomfortable.
I do have a question which has to do with this 21st century lens, though, because when we have a protagonist who we love and is dear to our hearts because we spend years with them, and they are coming from a situation which is not tenable today, how do we tenderly bring them to our 21st century audience who is very rightfully appalled or totally rejects certain positions that they might have? How do we explain that one?
I can, I think, as has been said, a lot of this has to do with the writing. One of the things that's very important to me is to create nuanced characters. So even my villain, and he was a villain, a fictional villain, had a rationale, had a reason for why he did what he did. And what he did was pretty unforgivable. I mean, he literally went out and murdered people. But I feel that we do need to grapple a lot of times with the terrible things that these characters have done historically, and bring that truth to the writing. In terms of the more sympathetic characters, I also feel like there needs to be nuance when you develop them as well. And even while, you know, as I said, I struggled a little with my heroine in terms of what she wanted. There were other characters in the book. The character of Francesca, for example, the Catholic woman who felt trapped, was very much a woman of her time. And it was fascinating to sort of embody her. And you know, so I agree with what was said before in terms of it's in the writing.
And I think it is also a question of understanding the person in the period in which the person lived.
Yeah.
And I think this is the best that we can do, because we want to go back to the past. We don't need to be writing about the past if we don't want to. So if we are doing it, is because we feel that that understanding of that past can enlighten the present. And I think that, you know, my characters do that. I try that the reader, by reading about the past, does have a better grasp on the reality that we are living today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is very much our role. Actually, since I am here, I have a question for Michelle that I am very curious about. Could I ask it? Is this okay?
Yes, yes, of course.
Very good. I am not sure if the people of Ancona accepted the French when they came to the city with Napoleon. Because when the French arrived in Naples, in the Kingdom of Naples, it's not Napoleon anymore that is leading the troops, but Championnet is the person leading the troops. And it is amazing what happens when they come into the city and these philosophes, this group of intellectuals opens the gates of the city for them to come in. So the bloodshed is beyond belief, and I don't have to go into that. But I wonder what happened in Ancona when Napoleon came in the 18th century, because the time is 2 years earlier, I guess, than they arrive in Naples.
And they arrived, yeah. Okay, so no, the Catholic population of Italy was absolutely did not want him there. They were terrified of him. They were terrified of him for a number of reasons, particularly because they were afraid that he was going to take their religion away from them. So they were not accepting at all. The Jews of Ancona were very accepting of him. And in fact, it's an interesting fact that the Jews of Italy gave Napoleon a Hebrew nickname. They called him Chelek Tov, which translates into his last name, Bonaparte, or a good part. But they had been, they had lived behind those ghetto gates for centuries. And so they were definitely looking for that emancipation that they had seen that was happening in France, So after exile of millennia, they greeted him very warmly. And there was definitely a feeling in Ancona too. The Catholics, one of the reasons they attacked the ghetto before he arrived is they felt that the Jews were hoarding weapons to help him conquer the city. But in fact, there was no bloodshed in Ancona when he first came in because he had negotiated with the Pope, who had control. And so that was why it was a relatively peaceful takeover there. Wasn't the same throughout Italy. And in fact, even after this, there were definitely riots and uprisings throughout Italy. They didn't go quietly.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
You have to put on your mute.
I have a question. I have a point, and I'd like a comment on it. We were talking about the difference between heroine, war heroes, and 21st century sensibilities and 21st century characters. I would think that even if we keep it to a ancient or historical character and the historical sensibility of the character, I would think that you have to find something that makes that character interesting in 21st century times, even if she isn't vibrant or feisty or whatever, but there's got to be something that we can relate to the 21st century that makes that character interesting to us. You agree, all of you?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the struggle comes in for me, is making sure that they do resonate with a 21st century audience.
In my case, I was just thinking about this in the afternoon. Eleonora, this woman who is writing the diary and might be facing impending death. She lived in a patriarchal system in which, she is, the father takes care of her and the father finds her a husband, either she wants it or not. And then she marries this man that the father finds for her, which is a total disaster and a total tragedy. And the dowry that she receives is taken care by the husband. He's the one who administers it. So this is a totally patriarchal system. But I was thinking today in the afternoon, wow, gee, you know, when I was in the nun school that I attended in Portugal in my youth, maybe it wasn't that different.
Yeah.
There are nuances here, you know. When I got married, my husband did not receive a dowry, and my father did not choose my husband, but the subtlety of patriarchy is still here.
Yeah.
Still here, and it's still visible every day. And it's the subtlety that makes the story so interesting.
Right. Agreed. My father said when my wife to be said she was going to work, he said, "God forbid." Now this is in my lifetime, so it's not that far away.
It's not that far away. I have a question, if I might.
Yes, Stephanie.
Okay. So my question is, and I've often asked myself this question: why historical fiction? I mean, what drew you each to historical fiction rather than writing about the nice couple next door in, you know, now or 2 years ago or something like that? What drew you to suddenly you want to spend 4 or 5 years of your imagination in Akona in the 18th century, or, you know, colonial America? What drew you? What made you go that way?
Well, I could start if Michelle and Julieta don't mind. Truthfully, I stumbled upon the story, and you know, being a journalist, you're always seeking an exclusive, and for me, it was finding a story from the 1700s. And truthfully, digging through those piles of research was like a treasure. For me, I nearly fell over each and every time I found a document, and it was like putting together a puzzle and just piece by piece put together.
Yeah.
Puzzle, yeah. And so I was sucked in quickly. I mean, I literally was reading everything I could that was written in the 1700s, you know, from newspaper articles to ads to books. I mean, everything I could find. I mean, what was the music back then? Oh no, it wasn't Beethoven. He wasn't born yet. So it was kind of really fabulous to be able to sort of just become engrossed in that time. I really enjoyed it immensely.
Julieta, you want to answer, and then I will.
Well, in my case, is very much where the mind goes and what you are doing at a particular time in your life. I started getting interested in Eleonora because I was living in Italy, and then we took a trip to Naples, and I am walking in the Spanish Quarter, and I see a plaque with the name Eleonora Fonseca Pimentel. And I looked, and then I looked again, and I said, wow, you know, this is not an Italian name, this is a Portuguese name, and who is this woman whom I've never heard about? Then I found more details about her, and then a few years later I find a plaque with her name in Rome, and I continue my interest in finding more about her. And then I am always moving between Portugal and the United States, and I hear about Joseph Correia de Serra, and then I say, oh, he's related to Eleonora. They both grew up in Naples. Oh, how interesting. Did they ever meet? Yes or no? And then, you know, my two characters, I have no historical evidence that they ever met, but there were 200 or 300 Portuguese families in Naples. It's impossible that they had met. But I have no evidence that indeed they met. And then, you're okay, they grow up in Naples, both of them. They go with their families from Rome to Naples. They are there for several years. Then Joseph goes to Rome, becomes a priest, and he has this life as a botanist where he goes everywhere. And then suddenly he's in the United States. And I had been to Monticello, and I remember the room dedicated to him. And I said, wow, here are two characters that we don't know a lot about. Why don't I do this? And so I don't think when one chooses it, but I think the characters choose us too. I think that is.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think that the stories choose us.
Yeah,
For me, that has always been the case. And the one time I tried to force it, I actually tried to write a novel before this novel about the Jews during the French Revolution. And it just, as I said earlier on, I didn't find the story, and it just didn't work. But I do think that we find things that are remarkable. I mean, in my first case, I found out about my rabbi ancestor, where my mother said we could always trace our roots back to the Middle Ages, and I didn't believe her until I did, because there was proof. And then with this story, like I said, I just felt like this story spoke to me. And the wonderful thing was that no one had written about it. At least I don't believe they had. But so I think that the stories do find us. I just want to add that I don't envy anybody trying to write about 2020. I think that is not going to be possible for a number of years to come.
I have read that when this whole horrible thing started, that agents were deluged with ideas for novels about the pandemic. Nobody did catch it. Would you buy a novel about the pandemic now? I mean, I want to get away from this pandemic into everybody's novels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, this is an interesting issue, because the pen club here in Portugal is asking the members to write about the pandemic. And you know, I flew out of New York a few hours before the calamity, and you know what is in my mind? It was what has been in my mind all these months. Sinatra's song, New York, New York. And the contrast between that song and what is happening now is really staggering. So I might write 3 pages about Sinatra's song and what it means to be as so many of you are now.
Yeah. People in New York were, we had this clapping. It's at 7 every night. And for a while, everybody was singing New York, New York, except I can't sing it because it doesn't have a classical melody. It drives me crazy. But the daring that you can come in, you can make it there, and you're in the power to go up against this vast city of dreams and make your dream come true. And now, of course, we've got this little bug going around, which is bigger than anybody's dreams and has brought down so many dreams. It's not able to best the other guy. It's this virus. So it's a whole different time. The New York that he wrote about at this moment no longer exists. Horrible to say.
Yeah.
Maybe
I have a question.
So I would like to say that let's have 2 more questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm still trying to understand exactly what the category historical fiction is. I hear people talking about using historical figures that people know, famous people. But what if you are writing a story that is primarily about women or other people who did not have any kind of a public profile? You're making up characters out of whole cloth. And so how do you remain true to history when you're making up so much? That's my question.
Well, I could start. You'll be amazed, Joyce, that so much is available. I mean, if you want to, I was looking, I wanted to know exactly what the weather was the day that supposedly George Washington and Mary Phillips met. And you can find that out. You can go to old newspapers that are available online, even in some digital archives. You can find out about what type of dance was done, within a year. I mean, you would know what style of the waltz was actually being done at that time. You can even find out flowers that were grown growing in that region, which was what I was looking up. And the foods, I actually have a book from the 1700s. It's a beautiful cookbook written by a woman named Hannah Glass. And so I wanted to find out what people might be eating at that time. And so Hannah Glass wrote an amazing cookbook, and you can actually get it online if anybody would be interested in eating something that people were making in the 1700s. But I actually made some of the recipes. So really, you can really get an understanding of what life was like in whatever time period you're thinking about. Even if you're creating a character, you can really get an understanding of what a day in that person's life might have been like, what it felt like, and what it may have smelled like even too.
Yeah, I have a mix. I have fictional characters alongside actual historical figures. Obviously, Napoleon was a historical figure. I mentioned a couple of others who actually were residents of Ancona, but everybody else is made up. And the gist of my story is basically these fictional characters. I think what makes it historical fiction is that it's the events taking place around them. It's what is happening in the world at that point in time. And, as Mary just said, it's being true to that time, knowing what they ate, knowing what they wore, knowing what the social mores are, etc. So I think that's, you can certainly write a book without, once upon a time they called them marquee characters, where they're real life people. But I do think there are different categories of that. I tend to fall in the middle again.
Just following in what Michelle is saying, there are different categories of historical fiction too.
Yeah.
And I think it's a question of where do you want your imagination to go? Because you can pick up a biography, as I did in my case, and I can choose three people who actually lived, and you fill the historical gap of what you don't know, and you use your imagination. Or then you can create totally fictional characters in the 18th century. And again, I think that the only rule here is to be true to the period. And it seems easy, but as a matter of fact, it isn't. And it is what Mary is saying. It takes years of research to search this and to search the other and to smell the flowers. And it takes years, but you really can go where your imagination takes you. It doesn't have to be biographical. It can be completely fictional if you want your imagination to go that way.
I recently took a fiction workshop, and I was the teacher, who is a well-known published novelist who doesn't write historical fiction necessarily. I mean, she complimented me on my research, but then she said I needed to work more on character development, dialogue, creating a setting that would, there's a lot more to writing an engaging book than just being true to the history. I guess that's why I brought up the question.
No, we all have to do that. Not only you, Joyce. We all have to do into character development and into setting and all of this. This is an issue for all of us, not you only. We start with truth and the facts, and then I think we go, and this is why it takes so long. I think we are all acknowledging the number of years that it does take.
Thanks, those are great answers, everybody.
The last question.
Deborah Feldman's been trying to ask a question.
My question actually has been somewhat answered, but my question originally was, how do you stop yourself from going down sort of a historic rabbit hole? I think we all have interest in history, and yet you want to have a plot that is interesting. So you've answered it somewhat, but I think all of us have just spent hours, Googling, and you get stuck, and you keep going and going. And but I do think sometimes, and maybe this is my question, have any of you uncovered a specific fact that has affected your plot and really sort of changed what you've written as you've come across it?
Mary?
without question, the two facts that I brought up when I was talking, the Ketubah workshops and the fact that Ancona was the world center of them, and the portrait of the Madonna, changed my book completely. I mean, the book revolves around those two facts, and I had no idea about them when I started my research. So absolutely. The other thing is I recognize all the temptations of the research black hole. And so one of the things that I do in my own process is I limit pure research to about a 3-month period. And then after that, I'm researching every day, but I'm writing along with the research.
I could say something on this, because I honestly, I believe, Deborah, that you should just get into the rabbit hole and just immerse yourself. I mean, the water's warm, really. It's if it wasn't for the rabbit hole, when I started trying to find, I thought I found this little romantic story, a courtship, or a date, or walk in the park between George Washington and Mary Phillips. And if not for just completely getting into that rabbit hole, I would not have found this idea that unrequited love may have sparked this flame that maybe ignited a cause that, oh no, did it become the American Revolution? So it's because of that, I believe I had success in writing the book. Smithsonian Channel is doing a documentary based on the research that I found, so I'm really excited about that. But it's because of the rabbit hole. So I say just get in there. I mean, because you'll be amazed at what you might find. I was researching up until 10 minutes before I handed in the manuscript, and I actually was making changes because I had to, and I thought, I cannot even believe what I'm finding here. So yeah, I think it's quite exciting. And you know what? Honestly, if you're writing, Deborah, and it's going to take you 6 more months, I say just get in there, and because you may find something that really is going to enhance your character, your story. It made the world of difference for me.
Julieta?
I agree entirely. I agree.
Perhaps you'd like to say something about Lady Hamilton and Queen Caroline and Lord Nelson, which I think is a different perspective than most of us have on Nelson.
Yeah, well, this is fascinating how we go about the findings and what we find when we dig into the material. And I wasn't at all, when I started, sure what accounted for the vengeance that was done to this character, Eleonora Fonseca Pimentel. She had a role in the monitoring, in the newspaper, but that might not explain entirely why she was brought to the scaffold. And then I started digging into the story, and she was the librarian of the Queen of Naples, Carolina. And Carolina was very good friends with Lady Hamilton, who after a while becomes the wife of the British ambassador, and she is the mistress of Lord Nelson. And suddenly, months later, I have a picture, a real picture, a sensible picture, a personal picture that explains the death of my character. It's not only her public role, it was who she was as a woman and how she was seen by the Queen and the mistress of Lord Nelson. So it's fascinating. As we go along, we discover more and more things. I do think that at one point you have to stop and hand in the book and finish, and then you start another project. But as you go along, it's fascinating. It's you can't stop. You really can't stop.
All right, well, thank you all. Faith, do you want to say anything as we close this wonderful meeting? And just a reminder, all of our wonderful authors' books are available or are about to be available on Amazon or any good bookstore. Faith, and then Susan.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah? I want to go on tour with Michelle and Mary. I want to, when the pandemic is over, I want to be like the 3 Sopranos, because I look at their websites and they are fantastic with publicity marketing, things that I know nothing about, and so I want to go on tour with them. Okay.
We'll talk after the pandemic, so.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Michelle, for being here. I enjoy this very much.
I just want to thank the panelists again for taking the time to join us and all the preparation. This was a lovely panel. We're getting lots of good comments in the chat section. I'm sure you've noticed. We will be posting this on our Facebook site, so you can invite people to come and see it. And all of the information about our organization in terms of how to contact us has also, Susan has posted in the chat. So it has our email address, our website, our Twitter, everything. So again, thank you, Loretta and Susan, for your hard work in putting this together and making it run so very smoothly. And I look forward to seeing you all at our activity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Judy.
And you're muted. Susan, you're muted.
Okay. This is Judy. Can you hear me?